there are many different types of experiences that we can experience that are traumatic. And it doesn't matter what kind of trauma you experience when it comes to impact and healing. Well, it kind of depends on who you might ask, but I think it is important to have a good sense of understanding how different types of trauma can affect you, both in terms of impact and what it means for healing. Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you for joining me. So this came up because I saw a question about a specific type of trauma, and I am going to talk about that. But if you've watched any of my videos, you know that I typically tend to talk about childhood trauma. And sometimes I will be more specific about a particular type of trauma, but I often kind of lump it all together in childhood trauma because in large part, the impact and the healing is very similar. Now, you've probably heard me talk about layers, and the layers can affect both impact and healing, but there's a lot of similarity when it comes to all forms of ongoing childhood trauma. So not like a car accident, that sort of thing, but more interpersonal trauma. And that's what I tend to talk about. And so I think it is important to be able to really recognize that there is a difference in terms of impact and healing when it comes to interpersonal and childhood trauma, particularly when those two things are combined. So the question was about relational trauma. And I don't typically use that phrase a whole lot, but you've probably heard me refer to interpersonal trauma, which is a person perpetrating a trauma on another person. And particularly in the case of childhood trauma, most times, most experiences of our interpersonal trauma that children experience, it is relational trauma. And that means that the person that is traumatizing you, perpetrating the abuse or the trauma, is somebody that you have a relationship with. Now, that relationship might be very different. It could be somebody that you have a relationship with that is kind of an external sort of thing, like a babysitter or a coach or something like that. So you still have a relationship with that person, but it isn't a familial type of relationship. So I do think it's important mostly to be able to recognize the difference because it does create additional layers and additional aspects of healing. You may have heard me talk about attachment-related issues and trauma and how, generally speaking, most people that have experienced childhood trauma are going to have attachment-related issues. And that is mostly because of the fact that it's happening in the context of a relationship. Now, people that don't have trauma based within the context of a relationship can also have attachment-related issues from their trauma. But when people have like a multitude of attachment issues and they fall into the different categories of attachment styles, oftentimes it is more relational. So what does that really ultimately mean in terms of you acknowledging, coming to terms with, and seeking help? Well, I think being able to recognize that when you are abused in the context of a relationship, the layers of trauma that you experience are deep. Every layer of that trauma is deep because it's happening in the context of a relationship. That doesn't minimize or take away from trauma that people experience that's not in the context of a relationship, because the impact overall can be as significant. But when it's in the context of a relationship, the layers that it adds are quite significant because it increases the sense of betrayal, the sense of trust, the inability to trust yourself, to feel safe in how you view relationships generally. Now, again, that doesn't mean that somebody who was abused not in a relationship may not struggle with those things, but the depth of struggle, the depth of impact is going to be more significant. Now, I want to be clear that more significant doesn't necessarily mean impacted more, but it does mean that in the healing process, the layers of healing will be more. The length of time to heal those layers will likely be more. Now, there are other factors that can influence how long it can take somebody to heal in which it didn't happen in the context of a relationship, because trauma does not happen in a vacuum. Everything else in your life, at the time, before that time, after that time, long into your adult life, all of that influences the ongoing impact and what will be necessary for you in regards to healing. So being able to oftentimes acknowledging to yourself is the most important and sometimes hardest thing. Well, all the time, I think it's the most important thing to be able to acknowledge to yourself. Oftentimes, being able to really recognize the impact can be quite challenging. So when you can recognize that the impact, those layers, are more significant because of the relationship that you've had and the betrayal that you have felt as a result of that relationship and betrayal, the trauma. With that acknowledgement comes validation. With that validation comes an awareness of compassion and understanding. Now, you may not feel that immediately, but it's there, because when you don't have that, you believe that everything that you think, feel, believe that is somehow bad is because of who you are. That you shouldn't feel that way, you shouldn't think that way, you shouldn't be bothered by it, or whatever it is. And that creates a lot of shame, among other things. So when you can acknowledge that and you experience that validation, it helps reduce over time, it helps reduce some of that. And that by itself is an important aspect of being able to heal. So when you're thinking about either your experiences, you're thinking about your healing journey, you're feeling frustrated with yourself, being able to acknowledge and truly honor the reality of what it means to have been somebody who's experienced trauma at the hands of somebody that you likely trusted, likely cared about, if not loved, should have been able to trust, likely had to continue to see at least on occasion, if not pretty much every day. Like, if you really think about the toll that that takes, and even if you can't really connect with the toll that it took on you and the reality of that, if you think about a child who, like, just, it could be an imaginary child, it could be a character in a movie, it could be your child or somebody in your family. If you think about a child, whether they're 3 years old or 6 years old or 10 years old or even 15 years old, or any age before or after and in between, who has to live every day of their life pretending that everything is okay, having to hold a secret that they know in a sense, kind of needs to be kept a secret. There's fear of it not being a secret. There's maybe even been some sort of threat, direct or implied, that it needs to remain a secret. The fear that a child would feel, the shame. And if you've experienced childhood trauma, you know what that shame feels like. And to be a child that carries that day after day after day, that is incredibly profound. So the validation, the acknowledgement goes a long way in being able to allow that child within us, no matter how old we are, to know that they're not crazy, they're not bad, they're not making it up, they're not weak, that it makes complete sense that they are deeply affected by what they experienced, that they might have difficulty with relationships or trust. They might find themselves feeling easily irritated or more depressed and down after being around people that they were around at that time. Maybe it's family members, or maybe it's even friends that they had at that particular time. The number of things that can affect us that seem like they really shouldn't, like they're not connected in some way, that can affect us, it's really quite amazing. And when we aren't aware and when we're not able to connect those dots, it reinforces over and over again that there's something wrong with us, that we shouldn't be feeling that way. We shouldn't still be struggling. Childhood trauma is impactful no matter who you are, no matter what the trauma is. Experiencing childhood trauma at the hands of somebody else is profoundly impactful, and there is no way that it doesn't affect you on multiple levels. Being hurt by somebody that you trust, that you should be able to trust, that you have to rely on, that you love, that should love you, that can seem insurmountable. It can be the most devastating thing that somebody will ever experience. Just that betrayal by itself, not to mention what is actually done, but the betrayal of that actually can be much more impactful than the actual things that are done to somebody. The fact that the person that you love, that should love you, that is supposed to protect you, that you rely on in some way, that you have to continue to see over and over again. It truly is certainly, if not the most difficult thing that anybody can live through. Because again, you're a child doing that, going through that, and you're almost always doing it on your own. That level of betrayal is so incredibly significant, and it takes a lot of healing. It takes a lot of experiences with people who are not perfect, but people who can show you over and over again that maybe you really aren't going to be hurt by everybody that you meet. It takes a lot of those experiences. That's part of the reason why healing from childhood trauma takes the time that it does. It takes so much practicing, because you have to continue to be able to allow yourself to experience things over and over and over again to learn the truth that you are worthy, that you are enough, that you are good, that it is not your fault or your responsibility. And you deserve to be able to feel that. You deserve to be able to trust in that. Somewhere between about 85 and 90% of people who experience childhood sexual abuse know their perpetrator. The majority by far of them trust their perpetrator. And as a child, you should be able to trust. You should have no experiences that teach you that people can hurt you. Unfortunately, that is not the reality for most of us. It doesn't mean that we didn't deserve it anyway. To have those people in our lives that we should be able to trust without any thought whatsoever. I'd love for you to share what came up for you. If this brought up some stuff for you, make sure to give yourself a little bit of time. Once this is over, maybe even now, pause and just take some deep breaths. Know that you're not alone. Try to really trust in that. I have been doing these videos for a long time, and there are so many people who watch them and sometimes feel like they're hearing things for the first time, even if maybe they've heard it before, but they feel like they're hearing it for the first time. And I share that because no matter where you are in this journey, to know that you are not alone, to know that the fact that you still struggle doesn't say anything about you, certainly not in a negative way. It is so important to know that and to eventually be able to trust in that. So if you can relate to any of that, I'd love for you to share in the comments, whatever it is you'd like to share, but just to make the reality of that known, that none of us are alone in this journey, that there are other people who can relate to what was shared here. Knowing that we're not alone is a really important part of the healing journey. Thanks so much for being here. If you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe and click the bell for notifications. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.